they took metal poles and just beat women and men, and these were like young student protesters. It was very brutal, and Ukrainians saw this. What originally possibly could have been just a smaller protest movement exploded. Michael Flynn, those of you who do not know who Michael Flynn is, Michael Flynn was somebody who was originally going to be a big part of the Trump administration as a national security advisor. So somebody who was advising the president of the United States on foreign policy, but then he got removed for a whole host of different reasons, but it had to do with his relationship with the Turkish government and stuff he did not disclose when it came to certain donations and money he took, and I don't want to get too into it, but you can look into it yourself. Well, Michael Flynn is in the news again because he says that Russia doesn't even want to, invade Ukraine, has only a few little tiny objectives, and it was Zelensky that is the big bad guy trying to escalate it, bring America into it, and he came to Congress and spoke to them in a terrible outfit. It is all Obama's fault. It's all Biden's fault, and we should stop supporting Ukraine. We should stop doing that. I wanna tell you though why I don't think Michael I was about to say Michael Tracy, why Michael Flynn should not really be listened to. Let's listen to the clip.
And they will drag us in further and further into war. They will use words like nuclear, which are really dangerous words to use, and they will use them and they will blame it on Russia. And believe me,
So I don't like doing the stop in the video, but I kind of have to here. First off, when we say drag America into it, we're not going to get personally militarily involved as in American soldiers on the ground. Biden's already made that commitment. The most we can really get involved here would be like if it actually like nukes started getting dropped and then we kind of like feel like we have to because the world's on the line, yada yada. But that's like a minuscule 0.5% chance, whatever, right? The other thing I just have to push back on here, the nuclear question he's bringing up here. Is anybody actually under the delusion that it was Zelensky that started bringing up nuclear Armageddon? Is there anyone who actually believes that? Why would Zelensky be the one to bring that up and be the one to originally bring that to the table when that's something that gives Russia more leverage? That doesn't make any sense. And we all know that immediately right off the bat, it was Russia making the threats. They've been making vague threats around these bombs since the war began. And they've done it on a constant basis, back and forth, flip-flopping on it. Yes, 1 second they're like, we would never use one of these weapons in Ukraine. And an ambassador will say that here, like the Russian ambassador to Britain. And the next sentence from Putin's mouth is, we reserve the right to use these weapons, da 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 da. Is anybody under the delusion that it was the Ukrainians that made this the issue? Anyone really? I don't know if he's just trying to slip that in. He thought no one would notice if he fumbled his words there. I have no clue, but everyone knows that it was the Russians who were making these threats because that weapon gives them leverage. So why would it be the Ukrainians that are bringing that to the table to garner attention? I don't understand it at all.
the Russian people have no desire to go to a nuclear war. They don't have any desire to stay in Ukraine much longer. But they're going to stay there, and they're going to meet their what has been described as limited objectives, and they're not going to drag themselves into a. So we're making this guy Zelensky because he.
I love this idea that he says they're going to meet the limited objectives. The Russians have yet to meet a single objective that they set out to at this war. Now, there's a lot of things that can be like implied objectives and stuff like this. Let's just talk about the stuff that they said out loud, even after the war started to go off tracks, and that's when they started to limit their goals more from just regime change to this, because originally it was just regime change. They wanted to put Yanukovych back in power. But the stuff that I remember was the demilitarization of Ukraine. Well, by God, that has not been achieved. Ukraine's more militarized than ever. It's more full to the brim of weapons than it's ever been. Two, it was the unifying of the Russian peoples in Ukraine, annexing the Donbass and eastern Ukraine, stuff like that. They have yet to capture Donetsk. They have yet to capture all of Luhansk. So they need to capture those in order to unite the Donbass under Russian control and they're currently getting slaughtered trying to take Bakhmut. I've been to the Donbass personally, and the fact that I've been to the Donbass, I've been to Kramatorsk personally, even when it was surrounded on 3 sides before the Kharkiv counteroffensive that broke any idea of them trying to surround it in the near future. Even the fact that I can go there is a testament to Russian failure. Stop the expansion of NATO. That was another goal. That's already basically failed, or it's like 95% there to failed, because Sweden and Finland are going to join NATO. And Finland has a border with Russia. So not only is there an expansion of NATO happening here, there's an expansion of NATO happening onto Russia's border that they can't do anything about. Anything. Then there was the denazification, which, I mean, we can apply what that means. That could either just be dumb propaganda. It could be a call for regime change. I guess that's up to everybody's individual interpretation. I tend to like lean in the middle there. I think it's basically propaganda. This war has basically nothing to do with Nazism. But I do think that there is some stuff implied there about anybody who is allied with Zelensky's government will be purged from their position, like all the mayors who were purged from their position even though they were democratically elected in all of Russian-occupied territory, many of them just going missing shortly after. And those are just a few. I think there's one objective I'm forgetting, but those were Russia's stated objectives after the war went off track. And it's been over 300 days since then. So this idea to meet these limited objectives when we're going on a year now of fighting in an operation that was supposed to take like a week, I don't know, man. It feels like the far right in this country are still drinking like copium. They're drinking, they're almost taking as much hard, just like gritty cocaine into just putting it straight into their system, almost to the same extent that the Russians are in some of these instances. Definitely when it comes to Michael Flynn.
We allow him to come in there, and there's just such ridiculousness.
Is occurred.
Fastin 666 has donated $10, chipping in to help on the DB.TV project.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate the $10, Fast 666. Even if you've obviously condemned yourself to an eternal suffering in hell through your name. I appreciate it. Thank you for the $10. Thank you. I do appreciate it. We will take that money and we will use it to pay our staff. And by I say pay our staff, what I really mean is not pay our staff. We rely entirely on interns. Thank you, though. I appreciate it.
Particularly by the Democratic Party cheering him on as though he's, the guy was dressed in a workout, suit, addressing the United States Congress. And so the things that he said, the direction that...
Can I just say, how much of a... And I'll put this in a blunt way. How much of a fucking bitch do you have to be to still be complaining about Zelensky's outfit that he wore to go to Congress? Benny Johnson was complaining about it. A whole host of people were complaining about it constantly afterwards. And you want to know why this is his complaint about his speech to Congress? Because Zelensky's speech was honestly really, really good. He spent half of it thanking the United States, making quotes from our founding fathers, talking about how much he loves America and all this stuff. And since there's not much to complain about in the speech, they have to be like, oh, well, he didn't wear a suit. And you want to know what would have happened if Zelensky wore a suit? It would have been, well, Zelensky's taking all this aid money, but then he's spending money on an expensive suit. 100% that would be the case. They just want something to complain about. That's all it is. Also, we know why Zelensky wore that outfit. He's very open about why he wears the outfit. 24 hours before he spoke in front of Congress, he was on the front line in the city of Bakhmut while the Russians are actively trying to assassinate him. And he has openly been like, hey, this is something I wear to remind everybody I'm a leader of a war-torn nation. I'm a leader of a nation at war. And I wear this out of solidarity with the soldiers on the front line, risking their lives and dying every day in order to defend Ukraine. Not only that, I didn't see really any complaining when Winston Churchill wore something that was even like 10 times more, I would say, casual when he visited the United States and made a speech to Congress. There's nothing to complain about. And so Michael Flynn just has to grasp at straws. And this is the best he can do.
That he is taking the United States of America is into a place where we do not want to be. We do not want to be tied up in any longer in this mess in Eastern Europe. This is a mess that was created by people like Zelensky. It's created by people in our own State Department. It was created prior to the Trump administration in 2014, the time frame when the Russians first went in there. This was totally avoidable, and the fact that we're about to give him even more money just tells you everything you need to know about how corrupt and criminal this entire enterprise is, of what's happening in Eastern Ukraine. We should stay completely out of this. We should stay completely out of it.
So first off, how do I approach that one? The idea that people like Zelensky or Biden and Obama caused this is not only reductive, it is purposefully misleading. If we look at every stage of this conflict, and I'm not even talking about looking at the crimes of the Russian Empire and the banning of the Ukrainian language or the Holodomor or any of this other stuff or any of that. We don't need to go into that. We don't need to go into history. Not that Michael Flynn cares about history. To that back far into history to really analyze how the situation came to be. Let me just give a basic retelling, and I'll try to make it as basic as possible, of Euromaidan to today. In 2012, Yanukovych, a leader of Ukraine, which was very, very sympathetic towards Russia, was reelected as president. While running for president of Ukraine for, I don't know how many, whatever number of times it was at the time, he promised that he would join this new arrangement with the European Union called an association agreement, which would allow, visa-free travel for Ukrainians, for them to get work, and a bunch of other economic benefits that the vast majority of Ukrainians supported and knew could help their economic situation, which at the time, and still today, could use vast improvement. 2 years later, he is in a position, Yanukovych, where his government is being economically coerced by the Russian Federation. They are stopping trucks from Ukraine from entering Russia in order to pressure him to not enter the association agreement he promised his people he would enter. By the way, on the Budapest Memorandum, which Russia signed during the collapse of the Soviet Union, agreed to not only not invade Ukraine and respect its territorial integrity, but also not to use economic coercion against it. So even before the invasion happened, Russia's already violating the Budapest Memorandum. In response to this, Yanukovych caves and says, never mind that association agreement, I'm going to pull out of it in the last second. And instead, we're going to start talking about this new thing with Russia. Ukrainians obviously are mad because they think Yanukovych basically just bent over backwards for a government that was economically coercing them into an agreement that's not beneficial for their future. Even after Yanukovych personally promised on the campaign trail that he would enter the association agreement. Then, protests start. Not that surprising. You break a promise and you cave to a foreign leader on an issue that hurts your country. Not that good for you. Makes sense that there would be protests. The government responds by beating the ever-loving crap out of these protesters. I mean, they took metal poles and just beat women and men, and these were like young student protesters. It was very brutal. And Ukrainians saw this. What originally possibly could have been just a smaller protest movement exploded in size and became the Euromaidan, or as many Ukrainians call it, the Revolution of Dignity, which was a massive protest movement against not only the fact that they pulled out of the association agreement, but against Yanukovych, who they saw now as a Russian stooge who caved to their demands. And they were calling for him to resign, for new elections, for, of course, the association agreement. There was a few others. I don't remember the specifics, but you get the general idea, right? As this protest movement continued to pick up, the government's response continued to get more and more and more brutal, with protesters being murdered by the government. This culminated with over 100 protesters being murdered, called the Heavenly 100, and eventually, after multiple rounds of failed negotiations, Yanukovych flees the country. Then, there was an interim leader installed. They hosted new elections. A guy by the name of Petro Poroshenko was elected president. And Russia, either scared about their base in Sevastopol not having its contract renewed, or any other number of reasons, as possibly Ukraine's westward shift was about to begin in a much stronger fashion now that their stooge was no longer there, says we are not invading Crimea as they invade Crimea. They lie about it the whole time, denying what was known as the Little Green Men who invaded there. They invaded, they captured it. According to Igor Girkin, who's the former Minister of Defense for the Donetsk People's Republic, they held politicians at gunpoint as the Crimean government was dissolved. They held a very obviously fraudulent and rigged referendum, and boom, they now made Crimea part of Russia illegally. They then sponsored for the next 8 years a rebel movement in the Donbass of people who were sympathetic to the Russian government, who still made up a minority, but there were those people who existed. He sent them guns, weapons, and even soldiers in many cases, even though the Russian government still denies this to this day. It led to thousands of people of dying, massive hit on the Ukrainian economy, huge tragedy. After 8 years of this, there's a few things like the Minsk Agreement and stuff like this to try to stop the fighting. It doesn't stop the fighting. And eventually, we lead up to today, where Russia now invaded on a much larger scale after saying again that they wouldn't invade, bombing and killing tens of thousands of people, possibly over 100,000 people, and doing tons and tons and tons of damage. And this horrible actions have included mass killings, bombing of civilians, torture, you name it. I've talked to people who have reported many of these things back to me through their own personal testimony, as well as many investigators have found audio evidence, video evidence, photographic evidence, and satellite photos that back up these accusations. And it's no longer even an accusation, it's just the fact of what happened. Michael Flynn looks at that situation and he says, that's Obama's fault, that's Biden's fault, it's Zelensky's fault, the Russians don't even want to be there. The Russians have been there for hundreds of thousands of years. They've been invading and occupying Ukraine. What do you mean they don't want to be there? Maybe the Russian people don't, but the Russian government almost certainly do. That's why they invaded. Also, if you guys are curious as to why somebody who was supposed to be, the national security advisor to the president of the United States, would say something like this, this is not somebody with a dedication to democracy. This is Michael Flynn. And I could go into any number of reasons why I don't think this man doesn't have a dedication to democracy. But let me just talk about the main one, which after the fact, he tried to reel it back. But this is, I think, the most telling sign to me. And we will, I think it might be good to just play the clip where it happened. I think maybe we can actually find a YouTube clip which will show what he said. So, as many of the people who watch this show know, I am a huge supporter of the struggle against the government in Myanmar, the military junta in Myanmar, which overthrew the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. Even if I have problems with Aung San Suu Kyi, the military which overthrew her is a genocidal regime which has killed many protesters and displaced over 750,000 people, Rohingya Muslims, horrible government. I support the resistance against them. I think anybody who can rub two brain cells together can realize that you should not support genocidal regimes and military coups that smash democracy. Now, with that in mind, Michael Flynn, while speaking at like a QAnon conference or something along those lines, endorsed a Myanmar-style coup in the United States when somebody asked him about it in the crowd. And I wanted to play you guys this footage to show you very clearly that this guy who hangs out with QAnon, who said, where we go on, to like the QAnon people, their slogan, he said it on camera with other people, took a pledge, a QAnon pledge, in order to pledge himself to a movement which is actively calling for a military coup in the United States. He calls for one, for a military coup to depose Biden. Let's play it. And he uses the worst example in the world, too. It's Myanmar, because Myanmar is like a military junta. Nobody would want to be that horrific government. Just ask the people of Myanmar. You can't meet anybody from Myanmar who loves that government. Anyway, honestly, I think it might be because the Myanmar government did try to say, oh, no, we're doing this because of voter fraud. Because they were either because they were listening to international voices and how this conversation about voter fraud has gone, but it's also like an old trick that they've used before. I think it might be a combination of that hatred of democracy Michael Flynn has, combined with, ooh, they kind of did some voter fraud dog whistles. So let's listen.
Simply be reinstated, that a new inauguration. It should be that he can simply be reinstated, that a new inauguration date is set, and Biden is told to move out of the White House, and President Trump should be moved back in.
I want to know why what happened in Myanmar can't happen here.
No reason. I mean, it should happen here. No reason.
A former U.S. Army Lieutenant General and former National Security Advisor appearing to endorse a military coup here in the United States.
Trump won. He won the popular vote and he won the Electoral College vote.
Michael Flynn spent Memorial Weekend at a conference in Dallas attended by QAnon supporters. So too did Sidney Powell, who was part of the former president's election legal team. Powell, who has represented Flynn, said Monday that the media had grossly distorted Flynn's comments. She denied Flynn had encouraged violence or a military insurrection, but
said that a Myanmar-style coup should happen in the United States. I don't know how more clear he could have been.
She didn't explain what Flynn had meant. Powell herself spoke of removing Biden from office over the weekend.
We're definitely in uncharted territory. There are cases where elections have been overturned, but there's never been one at the presidential level.
By the way, it's been a year since this happened. Every time these people are like, oh, it's coming, we're overthrowing the government. Like, it never happens. It's just all nonsense. They're all hucksters and con men.
Everybody will jump to point out. That doesn't mean that it can't be done, though. It should be that he can simply be reinstated, that a new inauguration date is set.
Okay, you get the idea. Anyway, Michael Flynn doesn't care about democracy. He just wants his way or the highway, which that's not how democracy works. So I'm not that surprised that Michael Flynn does not care about the democratic struggle in Ukraine or Myanmar.